Lecture 9, The Idea of Nature. As we determined in the previous lecture, we will begin our contextual research focusing on the concept of nature. Our research questions for this module include: what were some of the cultural assumptions about nature that resulted in the establishment of the national park system as a social institution? What roles did artworks play in this process? And what were the social issues that were produced or exacerbated through this process? In order to begin answering these questions, we need to know a bit about how ideas of nature have changed over time. In this lecture, we will examine the genesis of nature as a meaningful concept and discuss classical theories of nature, as well as nature as it appeared in early folklore. Let's start with a question. What do you think of when you think of nature? Take a minute and think. Well, many people, and I'm guessing many of you and your peers, think of things like trees and natural environments, spectacular mountain scenes, various kinds of leisure activities, including hiking and camping, as well as animal life. Do you think that Americans have always understood nature in these relatively benign ways? The meanings of nature have dramatically shifted over time in Western civilization. Nature, like art, is a concept, a product of social construction. Now remember, social constructionism does not preclude the actuality of things in the world. There is a tangible reality, things in themselves like trees and rivers and rocks. Social constructionism just repositions our understandings or the meanings of those things as created rather than inherent. Humans have been working to theorize nature and the human relationship to nature for centuries, if not millennia. And thus, the reigning definition of nature and its common sense usage has changed dramatically over time. To understand these cultural assumptions about nature and how they intersect with art practices and hierarchies of value, we must examine the history of the idea of nature in Western civilization. We'll start pre-Enlightenment. When humans were nomadic hunters and gatherers, concepts like nature and wilderness didn't exist. Why do you think this is the case? Foundational wilderness scholar Roderick Nash claims civilization created wilderness. What he means by this is the agricultural revolution that happened around 12,000 years ago birthed ideas about nature as uncontrolled, wild, and controlled, domesticated. These distinctions became necessary and meaningful to people who wanted to stay in one location to farm and build communities and towns. When humans were nomadic hunters and gatherers, the natural environment was understood simply as habitat. But as groups of people developed herding and agricultural practices that allowed for settlements, distinctions between plants, animals, and spaces controlled by humans and those not controlled by humans became critical. Settlements offered a level of comfort, safety, and food security that early humans found valuable to their survival. Settlements required animals that could be managed, plants that could be cultivated, fields for these plants and animals to grow, and corrals and fences to protect them from predators. Thus, humans began to distinguish themselves physically as well as intellectually from the natural environment, and they came to value control over that environment. Controlled nature was preferred to uncontrolled nature because controlled nature suited the purposes, survival, and comfort of humans. These early people told stories and created mythologies about themselves and their locations in the world, especially in relation to that which they could not control. So understandings of nature figured prominently in these stories and the resulting cultural practices. Remember our discussion about Neolithic peoples in Module 1? Their artworks were directly related to rituals that involved their concepts of nature. According to historian and religious scholar Mircea Eliade, most early cultures had some conception of an ideal environment where daily life was easy and secure because nature was ordered in the interests of man. In these early cultures, this ideal environment, perfectly suited to humans, was mythologized through stories and artworks as a kind of paradise. And people determined that through their efforts of control, they might be able to create this paradise. Early Western civilization imagined this achievable paradisiacal environment as pastoral. The ancient Greeks called it Arcadia, and as their philosophers theorized beauty, good taste, and art, so too did they theorize nature. They celebrated pastoral nature in their literature and arts, relishing its beauty. Pastoral means a bucolic rural landscape with farms and shepherds tending livestock. Roman poet Titus Lucretius Carus characterized the pastoral landscape as consisting of fields, crops, and joyous vineyards, and a gray-green strip of olives to run in between and mark divisions, adorned and interspersed with pleasant fruits, and fenced by planting them all round with fruit trees. Lucretius also storied the rise of man out of the wild. According to Lucretius and other poets, artists, and scholars of his era, humans had lived a nightmarish existence, governed by moment-to-moment survival, eat or be eaten. But through the invention of clothing, metals, ships, agriculture, city walls, laws, arms, meaning weapons, and roads, these people escaped their miserable condition by controlling the wild. By Lucretius's time, this was around the 1st century current era, humans had now achieved relative security and could enjoy what Lucretius referred to as cultural refinements and all the charms of life. So, these early civilizations established ideas about nature that would last for centuries and are, in certain ways, still with us today. Nature was beautiful if it was cultivated, fenced in, and dotted with herds of sheep and useful to humans. Nature was to be feared if it was not pastoral. Open meadows and cultivatable fields offered security and prosperity, while forests and mountains presented dangers, both real and imagined. One of the most historically influential perspectives regarding nature comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition, which reinforced and perpetuated many of the early beliefs regarding nature, especially the paradise myth and beliefs about wilderness. Wilderness features significantly in biblical stories as a symbolic concept. The biblical wilderness was desert rather than forest, unlike wilderness spaces that we think of today. But importantly, it was inhospitable and dangerous to humans, which is the point of the concept wilderness. It was imagined and explained as a curse from God, affected through periods of drought, a kind of hell on earth. Eden, on the other hand, was paradise, a well-watered garden filled with edible plants available without labor and in abundance. The animals were all peaceable and helpful. It is this story of the Garden of Eden and its subsequent loss that has been most influential to modern Western thoughts about nature. It concretizes the polarity of wilderness and paradise. They are physical and spiritual opposites. The widespread adoption of Christianity in Europe between 300 and 800 current era was accompanied by the belief that God had set man apart from and had given him dominance over the rest of nature in order to make it useful. While ancient Greeks and Romans appreciated and waxed poetic about the beauty of pastoral nature, early Christians cultivated an antipathy or dislike towards the natural environment and were strongly encouraged to resist any pleasures of the world. For instance, St. Augustine's Confessions around 397 current era, quote, admonished men not to take joy in mountains or scenery, but rather to look after their salvation. Medieval Christians gravitated towards the stories of wilderness as the earthly realm of the powers of evil that the church had to overcome. Wilderness spaces were also seen as locations where otherwise moral Christians could be tempted by the devil and immorality. One of the tangible consequences of this cultural assumption was that in their efforts to convert pagan peoples in Northern Europe, monks and missionaries would clear-cut forests and cut down groves. Many early folk stories and myths, from ancient Greeks to the Saxons and the Norse and the Germanic peoples of Europe, featured nature as a wild place filled with supernatural beings, like monsters, demons, gods, and magical creatures. Think Pan, centaurs, and forest spirits, in addition to the actual animal predators that hunted in these spaces. Influenced by Christianity, medieval European civilizations expounded upon the legends and myths of the wilderness, locating the devil and supernatural evil beings within the forests, along with the werewolves, trolls, and man-eating ogres. While these stories served a practical function of communicating the actual physical dangers of wild spaces, like getting lost or being attacked by a predator like a wolf, they also served another purpose. These stories were allegories and employed as tools to deliver moral lessons and critique certain social and cultural values and practices. These monstrous and evil wilderness creatures served as foils for increasingly civilized human societies. A foil is a character, typically in literature, that contrasts with another character, usually the protagonist, in order to critique or celebrate particular qualities of the protagonist. Wildness was not only considered undesirable in the natural environment, but also in human nature. Peoples who had not adopted a stationary agricultural existence were categorized as primitive and suffering from wildness. This early storying of nature addressed both nature as a particular configuration of the material world, like the woods, as well as nature as a kind of intrinsic value, human nature, the nature of the beast. This focus on nature as an intrinsic value would have significant implications for the social relations between European settlers and indigenous peoples in the New World.